What happens when Shakespeare meets Bollywood? When Mexican telenovelas intersect with Hindi cinema? Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of Indian cinema through a truly unique lens. To answer these questions, we are joined by Dr. Rubi Lozoya. Her journey into the world of Indian movies began with a single Bollywood film in a college dorm room and led her to become a scholar in cinema studies. From the golden age of Shah Rukh Khan to the streaming revolution, from feminist readings of classic films to the changing landscape of Indian storytelling, she examines it all. Get ready for a conversation that bridges continents, cultures, and cinema. Whether you're a film buff, a culture enthusiast, or simply curious about how stories travel across borders, this episode has something special for you. This is Adventures of a Bystander, and here's your host, Pranjal. Enjoy.
Dr. Ruby, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Perfect. So I remember when we talked last time, you had a very interesting story about how was it that you were introduced to Hindi cinema, Indian movies, and how you started to learn Hindi. So let me just take you back there when you were growing up and things like that. Tell me, when you were growing up, were you an avid movie watcher? Like, what's your earliest memories of watching movies?
I was much more of a reader than like watching movies. Watching movies really was a thing. Like once I started getting into Bollywood, really. And I got into Bollywood because my roommate in college, she was very much later, was from, she's Ethiopian, but she grew up in Kenya. So in Kenya, there's like a big Indian diaspora and there's like a lot of Indian movie theaters. So she also grew up watching Indian movies. And we were rooming together the first summer in college, in an apartment off campus. And the first movie that she showed me was Kal Ho Na Ho. And after Kal Ho Na Ho, I was like, this is it. I'm done. Like Shah Rukh Khan has changed my life. And this is why I got really interested in Bollywood. It had like everything I really liked of like the slow burn and like the tension between the Kajol and Shah Rukh Khan. And it was very curious because she also in Kenya grew up watching a lot of Mexican telenovelas. So she knew my name from a Mexican telenovela that like shares my name. So it was very interesting to be like, yeah, like there's a lot of similarities in Mexican telenovelas and in Bollywood.
And this was very interesting because usually when you mentioned that you were growing up in Mexico, I was curious, between Mexican cinema and Hindi cinema. Now, of course, there's so many hues to Hindi cinema, but movies like Kal Ho Na Ho, movies like Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, there's a certain over-the-top element, there's a certain grand element to these films. Was Mexican cinema also somewhat similar?
So my aunt, like once I got into the PhD and teaching Indian cinema, my family has been very supportive in that sense that they also started watching a lot of Bollywood movies. And the first ones, especially that like Shah Rukh Khan era of the 90s, 2000s, she tells me that it reminds her a lot of the golden age of cinema, of Mexican cinema. Like she calls them like they are like very like son muy blancas, which means that like there's no cursing, there's not a lot of violence, it's like a lot of romance, and there's a lot that you see also in a certain kind and a certain period of Mexican cinema.
Nice. But usually when I talk to a lot of my friends who are Indian Americans who grew up, who have family from India, but they grew up in America, films like Kal Ho Na Ho, films like Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum are also sort of their gateway in essentially learning about their culture. And all of this conversation took me to this really fascinating book which I was reading by Shrayana Bhattacharya. It's about desperately seeking Shah Rukh Khan. And it's an amazing, right? It's an amazing book on how a lot of Indian women felt that Shah Rukh sort of embodied that sort of man they wanted to meet. And eventually, that could be a son, that could be a husband, boyfriend, whatever. So you were introduced to Indian cinema through Kal Ho Na Ho. What happens then? So were you in like a time where you were just watching Shah Rukh Khan films? Who were the other superstars or Indian movie stars you got introduced to?
Yeah, no, so like, yeah, it was, no, so Shah Rukh Khan was like the gateway drug. And I'm still like between the three Khans, right? Like the question of who's your favorite Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan, Amir Khan, like my Khan is Shah Rukh Khan. So it was Kal Ho Na Ho, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, all of those. I wrote a paper in college about Kal Ho Na Ho and like a feminist reading with Kate Millett. And then during the summer, I think I started. It was when Netflix was giving you DVDs in the mail. So they had like a somewhat of a Bollywood collection,
Hmm.
but by chance, the ones that I was getting just by recommendations from my friends were not giving me those like very strong romantic feels. Like I watched Devdas,
Hmm.
the Devdas with Aishwarya Rai,
Sure.
and I hated it the first time
Hmm.
because it had like not the happy ending, and I
Sure.
wanted the happy ending.
Hmm.
But like it's a great movie, and I haven't seen it since. No, I've
Hmm.
not tried. I saw it again in grad school. Um, and then like my favorite is Shahid Kapoor.
Hmm.
Like the chocolate boy, like, and that's kind of really like my like what really drew me to it, like the baby face, all
Hmm.
the job we met, that kind of look.
Right.
It was like my thing. And then I saw him in Heather, and it's fantastic. Him as Hamlet, and like the whole change of him shaving his hair, and like that was a huge deal. But like it really was when he showed that he can be like an actor. Um, and it's one of the movies I still teach. It's one of my favorite movies too. And it
Hmm.
really closed together like the gap of I come from an English literature background. I did my bachelor's in English and French. So one of the classes I want to teach is like a Shakespeare like basically I call it Bollywood meets the Bard. So Shakespeare adaptation, Bollywood adaptations of Shakespeare. I'm very excited for that course. Hopefully in the future.
Wonderful. We'll talk about that in the future, like as we go on in the podcast as well. But you mentioned that you have this. You really like chocolate boys, and there's bunch of that trope is very famous in Indian movies. But I'm curious, in the '90s, Salman Khan was like the de facto chocolate boy. So how was
Yeah,
Shah Rukh Khan your Khan over an Amir Khan in Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak, or a Salman Khan in
yeah.
Hum Dil De Chuke Sanam or whatever?
I think it's really the difference between what gets like what gets imported, and it's a little bit difference between watching it here, like in the like outside of India and in India. I find more people that like for example, my Hindi teacher, her favorite was Salman Khan. But she also like grew up in India and I was in India watching films there. Whereas most people of the diaspora kids too are more of Shah Rukh Khan fans because that is really like who becomes the diaspora um, global superstar.
Hmm.
Um, I think personally, just that I like those movies more, and those were the ones that were more famous. I think I got into Salman Khan way later. Also, my introductions with to him were not in my like not to my taste great. They're great movies, hugely loved. They were not giving me the feelings like I think that era of Salman Khan was what um Tumakihikon.
Hmm.
I was like, that's very long and nothing is happening and
Sure.
everything is glorious
Right.
compared to like the ups and the downs of like Kuch Kuch Hota Hai and
Right.
but in that list, Amir Khan is also like he goes Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan, Salman Khan.
Right.
Who's
Makes
your what is your top three of those three?
So I think with me, a lot of well, for me, because I was not outside, and most of the things which at least a Kuch Kuch Hota Hai or a Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, they were as fantastical to us as they might have been to anyone else, right? Because technically, schools like those or families like those barely existed in India. But between amongst the three Khans, I think I preferred Shah Rukh as well, precisely well for two reasons. Number one, I felt he had the best songs thanks to
Mm,
the whole coterie of Abhijit and Kumar Sanu and all of those. He had and Sonu Nigam. He had great songs, and Shah Rukh Khan, of course, had a much more cosmopolitan sensibility around him. Like
mm,
his ideas, his interviews, of course, his wit was something everyone knew, and whenever we would see that the interviews, we could make out that yes, this guy really is a very sharp guy. So I would say, yeah, for sure, Shah Rukh. Salman later became a little more. I mean, when I enter into that teenage phase where I wanted to see films like, when I wanted to see the Sanjay Dutt and Salman Khan. So that was a time when I really enjoyed those people. But I think I completely understand why Shah Rukh Khan became such a global icon, even more so than some of the actors who might have preceded him, like an Amitabh Bachchan or even a Dilip Kumar, who I feel
mm.
might be much better actors, but they never had that sort of global outreach. And thanks to Karan Johar, a lot of the films which these guys made were sort of taking into consideration the NRI audience. So that's why the schools of Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, the families of the Rai Chands in Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum and things like that. I'm curious. You mentioned that you did English literature and French in your bachelor's. So you've essentially been exposed to three very different cultures: the Indian culture, the English, which is UK and America, and then there's French, and then of course Mexican. But how are the three cinema industries very different? Like, have you had a chance to interact with French cinema? What do you think of it?
So yeah, so I did and though in my undergrad I was very lucky that I was in in a place that I was able to basically take a bunch of courses and like exposed to get a lot of exposure. And then I did my master's in complete, and complete is very much like that. It's like multiple, you're working with multiple national literatures, and in this case cinema as well. But in undergrad I took a course on French and Francophone cinema. And a lot of people, when they think of French, they only think of France and maybe Canada. But obviously, because of the colonies, all of Africa is there. And to have a course in a very small place in New Mexico to teach Francophone cinema was excellent. And I was very lucky to have it. So I saw a lot of films of like important Francophone films like Battle of Algiers and like movies about the Kasbah. What's the name? What's the name in English? Anyway, I'll think about it later. It was Osman Semben's movie. Like, I'm forgetting the name. Black Girl. Yes. So like that was fantastic to get an appreciation for, and also to just to look. What really brought my interest in looking outside of those main Western canons, really. And that's really what got into the PhD and the master's of like, once you want to get into a PhD in complete, you need 4 languages. And I knew English, French, and Spanish. And I didn't want to just do another European language. So which is what brought my interest in Hindi, precisely to look outside of the Western canon of films. Because if you just look perhaps at the idea of, instead of like East and West, and perhaps even beyond the idea of the global South and the global North, everything becomes much more interesting in terms of like even the small trivia things, like the largest industry in the world is not Hollywood, but rather India, in terms of the number of production of films.
So, so when you mentioned that when you're looking at French cinema, then you're looking at Indian cinema, Hindi is not something which you've learned. Right, Hindi is not something which you know when you've been introduced to Kal Ho Na Ho, perhaps.
Right.
So I got a chance to like watch some Japanese films and French films when I was growing up, and never did I think I'd be able to pick up on the languages. I was just doing the subtitles, and I was like, all right, this is probably the best where I get to. How difficult was learning Hindi then? Did you have teachers? Like how did that journey start?
I mean, it was more difficult than French.
Oh, okay.
And in English, I learned in bilingual schools in Mexico, so I don't recall it being difficult. French is very close to Spanish, so it wasn't that hard, except that like French pronunciation is very difficult. Like some letters you don't pronounce on a Tuesday, for example.
Yeah, okay.
But Hindi is different because it has less cognates, but it's still what is called an Indo-European language. So Hindi has more in common with, say, Latin and therefore Spanish than with other Dravidian languages. So even though both are in the South Asian cone, Hindi has more in common with Spanish than it has with Tamil. So in that sense, there were things for me to pick up on, like there's gender in Spanish and there's gender in Hindi. Many times they don't overlap. Like just because you know the gender of something in Spanish, it won't necessarily mean that it will be the same gender in Hindi. But it's something that I was already used to thinking about or of while learning a language, compared to, for example, Americans, that they don't have gender in their nouns. So what I did is I started with Rosetta Stone by myself. And then by my master's, I took my first 2 years of Hindi. I studied in India, in Jaipur, at the American Institute of Indian Studies for a semester. Then I did 1 year of my PhD here at UT. And then I went for 1 whole year for learning Hindi again in Jaipur. So after that year, I was pretty fluent. And I lived with a host family who are very great. They're lovely people. And that was also like one of the huge reasons that my Hindi got better, was living with a host family and having like a pact with my friends of like, we're only going to speak in Hindi, even though they were English speakers.
Amazing. I went to study in Jaipur. I did my bachelor's in Jaipur, so I can only imagine Jaipur is a great, fun city to be in. But once you started picking up on Hindi and the conversational fluency came in, now you could watch the films without subtitles. Were you also introduced to Hindi literature? Do you have any notable books you can recall which you really enjoyed reading, which were from Hindi authors?
Not books, but I can only think of my classes. Like I took a fantastic class with now a professor who's not here anymore. He retired, Dr. Rupert Snell. He was like the Hindi professor here at the university. He wrote the textbook I used to learn Hindi with. And I was in one of my favorite classes. He taught a class called Love and Lovers. It was a fantastic class, but we also learned and read in Braj Bhasha. And that was incredibly difficult. But we read a lot of poetry in Hindi with some help of translations. That Viraha poetry was something I really enjoyed. So like it was really like for someone coming from Bollywood to take a class about Hindi, love writing and love poetry, was fantastic. It was really like, oh, this is the class for me. And so like reading those things of what love meant, for example, like the writings of Mirabai, that they look or they read like poetry for a lover, but the lover is Krishna. It was very interesting. Like the devotional and the romantic was fantastic to read. One thing he also had us read was, and it was fascinating, the way that British officers were learning Hindi some British officers were learning Hindi in India was through like erotic poetry. So they would have all these sassy things that they would have to translate. And even there was like language learning material. So on the one hand, you know that like they're going to want to learn this, right? Understanding human psychology. But also like we are modest people, we're going to censor it. So even if it was a language material, it would have the rhyme, but the saucy parts would be censored. So that was very interesting to see in his class.
That is fascinating. I was reading this book by Madhavi Menon. It's called A History of Desire in India very recently. And it actually spoke to a lot of these things that especially Mirabai and a lot of that also went for a lot of Sufi people, that they talk about love, they talked about desire, but necessarily the person they are desiring might not be a person. It could be God, it could be some energy, it could also be a person. So in that sense, definitely the Indian subcontinent has had a very fertile history of understanding erotic literature, understanding sensual literature. So when you're mentioning love, and we talk about Bollywood, of course there's Hindi, but there's of course Urdu. There's a very rich tradition of Urdu in Hindustani. Did you learn that in your course as well?
So a lot of us that learn Hindi, we are also like taught how to read Urdu. I've tried many times to like teach myself, and I started and I haven't been able to master it. I find I think between like Devanagari and Nasdalik or Nask, Devanagari is way easier compared to Nasdalik. But like as you mentioned, right? There's a difference, not a difference. There's basically Hindi and Urdu are basically the same language in terms of where they come from. It is until you get to higher registers that you see the more Persian influence and the Sanskrit influence. But the distinction between the two is a little bit more political than actual people that can speak Urdu can understand Urdu, Hindi speakers, and vice versa. It's only in the writing that there's a difference. But no, I haven't been able to read Urdu. It was one of those like summer projects, that every year you started like this summer, I will learn how to read in Urdu. And I have some books in it.
Okay.
But yeah.
No, makes sense. And I would agree that even people who read Urdu and who can write Nustalik do admit that the Devanagari script is a much more accurate script to write Urdu in, because all the nuktas and all, I mean, not the nukta perhaps, but all the stresses and all the accents are much easier in Devanagari than in Nustalik. So you're here, you've read English, you've read French, you've been introduced to Hindi cinema. Did you ever undertake like any sort of historical study of Indian cinema as well? Because, you have your projects where you talked about the female pioneers in Bollywood, and you start from Fatima Begum. And of course, going all the way there. So how have you seen Indian cinema change? You were introduced to the Hindi cinema of the 90s. What did you feel about the Indian cinema of perhaps the 60s, 70s, and now the 2000s?
Well, I mean, usually when we teach the history of Indian cinema, it is through those male figures, right?
Right.
50s, Raj Kapoor, 1970s, Amitabh Bachchan, 1990s, Shah Rukh Khan. And when I teach the class now, after Shah Rukh Khan, I say we don't have a male as the figure, like a male actor as the figure, but perhaps as a director would be someone like Anurag Kashyap, like really changing the look for a long time. And now the shift after Kashyap has been not from him, like, whereas Hindi cinema, Bollywood in a sense, which we should not conflate the two, but still, is the Hindi cinema as the pan-Indian cinema now in recent years has been the cinema from the South that has become the pan-Indian cinema, right? Bahubali 2, RRR, right? A lot of like of success has come from the South, which is a huge shift from who like the films that everybody was watching were Hindi films, and now the films that everybody is watching are films from the South. I think that's in big strokes the change that I have seen, or like usually how I think of historiography. But as you mentioned this with Fatma Begum, I would be remiss to mention that it is important to notice that we tell the history of Indian cinema through male figures, right? So female actors, female directors, female stories are always like secondary to the main way of thinking about it. And Fatma Begum is it's a great example as the first female director in the history of Indian cinema, that she was there since the 1920s, 1930s, right? Many times we think of female directors as coming around like Zoya Akhtar and all like that generation, like very recently. But this woman who I'm writing about, and actually want to write like her biography, not only was she incredibly productive for the 1920s, 1930s, but she started as an actress. But she also wrote, directed, and produced films. She had her own film studio, Padma Films, and then Victoria Films. So when we think of like female directors now become producers, like Anushka Sharma, who started as an actor and now she's as producer, the history is actually much older, and it's very exciting to know more about her.
Amazing. But usually, and I think I would agree, most of the Indian cinema, when you read the history, even relatively more academic works, it's mostly the men who are sort of in the driving position. There's a few exceptions. There's the Devika Ranis of the world and Renu Salujas of the world, but they're always sort of taking the backseat. It's always the protagonist is always a man. When you're studying about, whenever you're trying to research Indian film, right? How does the research usually work? So let's say your work on Fatima Begum, when you're working, if you want to write a biography, do you need to necessarily go to Bombay? Is there archival work involved? How does the technical chops of all of these projects come about?
So it really depends on what is your discipline. I think there was a generation of scholars that came to Indian cinema as like either their main background or education was literature, and then they were also teaching Indian cinema, or they had another kind of training. So they were historians or they were anthropologists, and they also taught Indian cinema courses. There are also a lot of scholars who are cinema scholars that also are Indian cinema scholars, both in India and in the US. And their approach is different, basically in the goal and the methodology and the training that they have. So we have some historians, like Indian cinema historians. Some are more media studies, some are more anthropology studies. So I think Indian cinema in general is very interdisciplinary, and you can approach it from different places. And there are some of us as well that are close readers. So there's a generation of like Madhur Prasad, Lalita Gopalan, who are reading film. I'm obviously just to mention a few. But also there's film historians, and they're mostly working on archival projects. There's also people that go to the field and interview people. This is not necessarily Indian cinema, but Bangladeshi cinema. There's a scholar who worked in the cut piece. So basically, a cut piece is a piece that you remove and then they put up again. And she did anthropology of media in Bangladeshi cinema. So there's many different ways. For my first book project, I did go to India because I was also studying under an anthropologist, and the department is very interdisciplinary. So I went to Bombay and I did field research. I did interviews with many film members, like directors, makeup artists, ADs, writers, editors, and then what we call participant observation. I went to film sets. I watched 3 shoots. I went to film markets. I went to Film Bazaar and film festivals like Mami and Goa to get a sense of the place and the questions I wanted to ask.
And usually people from the film fraternity, were they open to talking to academics? Is that something they're very attuned to, or was it new for them? How was that experience?
They're very they're very open to talking to academics. One of my favorite lines of a book I read, which was not my experience, but it kind of tells you that you can get access to people in Bollywood, or at least you could, in a much easier way that I think you could get in Hollywood, is that a brilliant book by Tejaswini Ganti called Producing Bollywood. The first line of the book is, when I was interviewing Shah Rukh Khan for my dissertation, and I was reading it at the airport, I was like, how do you just talk to Shah Rukh Khan for your dissertation? So obviously I did not get that kind of access, but it was just like a brilliant. I mean, of course, I would write that as my first line as well if I was able to talk to Shah Rukh Khan for my dissertation. But in general, people were very open, and some people were very open to talk to me instead to journalists, because they're already like media trained, right? They know that they're going to give interviews, but they're also very aware that the media interviews might not get everything they want to say right and correctly. So talking to academics is their chance also to delve a little bit more than the soundbite or the tagline that they might get in an interview with a reporter in a magazine.
So your colleagues or people who might be working on, let's say, the American films in Hollywood or UK films or whatever, is there that sort of an opening for academics to go and probably talk to a Tom Hiddleston or go and talk to a Brad Pitt, or is that a very Indian thing, and which is a good thing, I guess? If the superstars are not gate kept from academics, then that's a great thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very Bollywood thing that we have that kind of access. I cannot imagine like saying, like, I always go like, what it would be to like talk to Brad Pitt just like that,
Right.
But maybe Matthew McConaughey here in Austin,
Could be. Yes, Matthew McConaughey could be after one of the football games when he's happy.
Yeah.
Perhaps today, if UT beats Ohio, right?
Exactly.
But so when you were talking to a lot of people in Bombay right now for this particular research project, do you still find the Bombay film industry to be as male dominated? We are sort of now getting into the meat of a lot of papers which you've wrote around things like ambivalent sexism and all of that. So what is the landscape now, right? We have someone like a Payal Kapadia come out with All We Imagine As Light. There's so much hue and cry, so many people are there to support. But ironically, when you watch the film and you watch the credits, a lot of the patrons and agencies, they're non-Indian. So
yes.
So it's either French or whatever. So yeah, what's the current landscape like?
So like in the short answer is yes, it's still very male dominated. It's better from like progressively better historically, but it's still very male dominated. When I was doing my research, I opened my presentations and part of the book with this interview they had in the movie Mela in Bombay, which is basically like a short, like different interviews and like panels before Mami starts, the Mumbai Movie Festival, Film Festival. And it was Alankrita Srivastava and 4 other male directors. And so it was 6 people on stage, 7 people on stage, 4 male directors, Alankrita, Anupama Chopra, and another male critic. So visually, it was very clear that of all the directors they invited, 1 out of 5 was male, was female, right? And when there was a reporter who actually asked this question precisely, it was like, you're making these big claims of the changes in the film industry, and yet we only have one woman on stage. And Alankrita made a point of like, this is kind of actually representative of the industry right now. And I did the math, and basically there will be 20% of directors are female. The actual number is less. It's around 9% according to the Gina David Institute. So it really, like, even mathematically or visually, yeah, there's less, but it's even less than you actually think. Around, I think it's 12%. I would have to check my numbers recently, but of all the people that work in the industry are women. So it's still very much a minority. And what I discuss in the book is that there are some places where you see more women, for example, in editing. And why that's the case is something I talk about in my book. Where you see only 25% of all lead characters are women. So it looks like there's more, but there's still like only like 1/4 of all the main lead characters. And this also has lead or co-lead. So if you have a romantic couple, that also counts. So it's a very, like, when you start looking at the numbers, the picture starts getting like, no, we're still not very represented like as women in the film industry. And I would say in the last 5 years, the shift that was going as progress has gone back. You know, you see a return to a lot of films that are very macho dominated, right? Something like going back to Shahid Kapoor, right? Which I still love as an actor. You have the Chocolate Boy era of him and Jab We Met, this different kind of art role in Heather, and then you have what Arjun Kapoor, right?
I think you're talking about Kabir Singh.
Kabir Singh, yes, Kabir Singh, yes.
Right.
And
Arjun,
that I think
was
is
the remake of Arjun Reddy, yeah.
Yeah, Arjun Reddy, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, thank you. Kabir Singh, right? And Kabir Singh is that example of that kind of like macho film that you're seeing again.
So that takes me to two broader questions. Number one, as far as the women participation in the Indian film industry goes, is that if that is at a low, all-time low, we've sort of regressed over the last 5 years. Do you think that's because of structural impediments in just the way the industry is structured? Or is that just because, I mean, women are just not joining the film industry because, you know, it could be a pretty punishing place? That's question number one. And question number two was about just if you take a step back and just look at the role films do play in any society. The fact that there is a Kabir Singh, also doesn't it highlight that those are the sort of stories which the audience currently wants? So as opposed to seeing a change in society, cinema is just like a mirror or like a downstream of culture. So how do you look at the two things?
So those are two great questions that I address in the book, which is great. So like, and it's coming up in 2026. So for one, the first question, just to make a point, I don't think the number of women is at the all-time low. Historically, I think it has increased, but it's nonetheless way lower than the celebrations that we were having of like, oh, we have more female participation. We have a lot of post the Me Too movement. There was a push, and you could see it in the films that were being pushed. You could see it in the things that we were talking about in Indian cinema. Like the Women's Collective, especially all the movements that were happening, especially, for example, in the Kerala industry. But that has stopped or has lingered back, you know? So it sounded like progress has been made. It's like this kind of mission accomplished thing beforehand. Mission has not been accomplished. That's one. And to the second point on if it's cinema just a mirror of society, It is, but it's also, it shapes society as well. And that is really the push and the pull of cinema has always been this of like, do we blame cinema for this, or is just reflecting what is there? And both things, even though they're opposite, are true. Something that I teach in my subversive cinema course is the fallacy of this 10 effect fallacies, which is this one of the like is cause and result, right? Just because we have a lot of violent movies does not mean that we're going to have more violence. And this is seen in many in many cases, right? Just because we have a lot of violent video games doesn't mean that it's going to cause an uptick in violence, right? That's the role of media. But to the larger role that you're discussing of masculinity, I do find that cinema has taken a different place in people's lives. So before, cinema was the thing that everybody had in common, and then we had television. Like you could have this metaphorical or imaginary cooler conversations of the movie you just watch. We all had the same cultural language. When Jaws came out, everybody was talking about Jaws. When um Kalhona Ho, Kabikushi Kabigam, all of those came out, we had the same language. It was when Rangila came out, people were dressing like Amir Khan, right? And then you have the shift of television, and people were talking about Breaking Bad. We had these moments where we all were watching Game of Thrones together in India and in the US. And now I would say that is kind of breaking apart, right? We don't have those common conversations, especially, and this is the role of streaming, by this niche suggestions, these bubbles that we call them epistemic bubbles that they're creating because of the hyper focus recommendations that you get. So my Netflix is not your Netflix.
Right.
And that creates a way of looking at the world that the world is this, but actually it's not. It's my world looks like this.
Sure.
And in the place of cinema or television is this very short content that you find in places like YouTube Shorts or TikTok or Instagram Reels. That has become the way that I think more people consume media in general. And I see this with my students. The media they consume is closer to YouTube rather than to TV shows, and movies are very much like tertiary to all of this.
So, talking about the epistemic bubble point which you made, don't you think that for a country like India, where just the linguistic diversity is so vast that there's of course Bollywood, which is the Hindi film industry, there's the Malayali film industry, there's Bengalis, everyone. Epistemic bubbles always existed. Like even if you go way back, there was always a Satyajit Ray making films for which might have been a slightly more highbrow audience, while other people were doing their own things. So after the stream, I would have guessed that as OTT becomes more prevalent in India, the common language of just good, sensible cinema would become more universal. So it's sort of contradictory to me when you say that the epistemic bubbles, everyone is just doing their own thing, and it's that the universal language is being lost.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. And this is great. What I talk also in one of my later chapters is precisely this, that streaming platforms came with this, especially the very, very beginning of Netflix came with this, not promise because they didn't promise anything, but they came with this idea that we're going to show you the world, right? We're going to open up the many things, right? Especially because the problem or the challenge or the obstacle to face was getting to theatrical, right? Well, how can I get the most number of people and that's through a theater, right? Because others were the niche ways, like film festivals were not accessible. So the best way to reach the most number of people was through the theater, right? And then also take into consideration that not everybody has theaters, right? There's places outside of India that you have like travel cinemas to reach people, etc. But the streaming platform came as a alternative, let's not call it a solution, to the theater, because those films that were not getting theatrical releases could thrive in streaming platforms. That was the idea, the goal, the hope. And it was like that for a very brief time. I spoke to filmmakers who were able to sell their films and they were to have like a distribution network that they wouldn't have found otherwise. But that is, I would say, is no longer the case, right? So it came with all these force, and it's not delivering that, and it's replicating certain levels of exclusion that I see. For example, going back to the idea of the male figure in how we talk about the main points or the main actors of Indian cinema. it was replicated immediately when Netflix and Amazon Prime started buying content for the platforms when it just opened in India. Netflix bought all of Shah Rukh Khan films, and Amazon Prime bought all of Salman Khan films. So they were trying to get their catalog with the big hitters. So what happened to buying from independent filmmakers? They immediately went back to what they knew was going to work because they had that. And now we have the problem of vertical integration, whereas something like Geo sells you the phone, the network, and the content. So they are the ones choosing what you get to see, and getting you in their ecosystem. And then instead of being suggested more things, you are locked in. And it's what happening with Netflix too, right? It's not suggesting if you like that whole thing of the algorithm suggesting you more things of like, if you like this, go watch this. Now it's like, if you like this actor from Netflix that we have, watch the same actor from Netflix. Do not leave this platform. It's rewarding sameness rather than curiosity.
So, I think precisely when the larger OTT platforms essentially renege on the whole idea of supporting independent filmmakers and being that avenue for people who can't get theatrical releases, players like Mubi come in, right, where they're just taking the cinema, independent cinema, and rolling on with it. I was just thinking aloud. I'm just thinking this aloud. The way the form of any art medium gets affected so much by the medium it eventually decides to air on or go by, right? Back in the day, most pop songs used to be 3 minutes or 4 minutes because the records were only 10 inches, and that's all the song they could hold. So I'm wondering, when you look at Indian cinema going from single screen to the multiplexes to now the OTT, do you see a change in the types of stories which are being told in India at large?
Yeah, and speaking directly to what you mentioned of form, the very first change that we noticed was the movies are getting shorter, except for like the Bahubalis and RRR. A lot of Indian cinema went from 3 hours to now they're closer to 2.5, or like even like they're getting closer to the Western standard of 2 hours. They're way shorter. So that's one thing that we see. And the other big change was serialization. So we don't have as many directors and actors working on films, but they're working on series, right? So we changed from the long format to the episodic. Right. And it's a very interesting for us as scholars, because the whole thing is like, oh, I cannot watch a movie 3 hours long, but I can binge watch 3 episodes that are 1 hour each.
Right.
And we're still like following those debates of how is it their attention span can do those large binge watching sessions, but we cannot commit to a 3 hour format. And I think there's something about this arbitrary stop, but this stop changes the way that writers write their films, right? Indian cinema has always been very different than Western cinema because of the 3-act structure of Western films. But with Indian cinema, you have the intermission. So you have to have basically 2 climaxes, right? Something happens in the middle, and then you have a hook, go to a bathroom, go have popcorn, and then come back. So you need to, the writing is different of Western cinema and Indian films. In the episodic, you need a hook every episode, right? After 1 hour, you need another hook that people keep watching to the next episode.
That's very interesting. I never thought of it, and it makes complete sense that if you're trying to write something which has an intermission, and it's an explicit intermission, not like one of those where it's a choice if theaters want to give it or not.
Right.
But you've got to just write the script in that way. And it's surprising you notice Indian films are getting shorter, while movies like The Brutalist and Killers of the Flower Moon are getting longer. Now we are having Hollywood films which are like 3.5 hours. In general, so we've established, as the OTTs sort of start coming in, there's a change in the way cinema stories are told. Arguably, if you sort of manage to divide the whole story in 1 hour chunks, you can actually tell a much longer story than you would have had in like one composite movie. In that sense, do you see the OTT films which are coming out to have more women-related stories? Are more stories being told about issues of women? I mean, movies like Lapata Ladies comes to mind, or things like that. But what's your general sense of that?
I would say no. Like when Geo released his first films, if maybe it wasn't the first, but the number that comes to mind is that when I looked at this recently, the most watched film of this period of time, which I can check which one it was a geo film, which means because it was free, right? So the what is really driving this is the access, which is if you have free access to YouTube or to things like Geo or MX Player, is like what's driving that attention, that audience is accessibility. Geo, if you get their data in your phones, you get Geo Cinema. The most watched film of the time was the latest also Shahid Kapoor movie, Bloody Daddy.
Hmm.
It was again a very macho
Right.
action-driven film. So and I think, or my argument would be, is that it's not because I don't think it was heavily announced or anything, but it's just it was accessible to people right there. So
Hmm.
it has a captive audience.
Hmm.
Compared to La Pata Ladies, and this is what you mentioned. La Pata Ladies, I believe, was India's submission to the Oscars, right, this year.
It was, and it was a pretty a contentious submission, because a lot of people thought All We Imagine Is Light should be going there. But I think the Academy had this idea that All We Imagine Is Light looks like an Indian movie filmed by Europeans. I don't know, that's an arbitrary criticism, but La Pata Ladies felt like an Indian movie, and I don't think it's made the cut in the Oscars. Yeah.
Exactly. So like and again, both of them are female directors, which is great, but it's like this whole, what I would call a facade of actually of progress is really not there, right? We had like a film like that was already like very successful, and it's a brilliant, lovely film. It's actually it's fantastic. I actually recommend anyone to watch it. It was not chosen, right? So what are we really doing?
No, completely agree. And going back to a bunch of these, so in one of your papers, you quote scholars who calls the Indian film industry lewd, lecherous, and hyper-sexualized, which I mean, as soon as I hear these words, I can think of so many OTT shows where they were just doing that. That was the whole idea behind those shows. Even something like a Mirzapur became very famous precisely because it was so lewd, it was so lascivious, it was so, so many expletives and things like that. So I can see what you mean there. You use lipstick under my burqa as one of the exemplars when you talk about just marketing films which are concerned with women's issues, and you write, and I quote, in terms of you're talking about the marketing styles, that this distinction conflates urbanism with education, taste, and liberalism, which in turn fosters a monolithic assumption that the other is uneducated, conservative, lacking cultural refinement. Is that still the case? Because Lipstick Under My Burqa is a story about women in small town India. But for sure, this was a movie which was really consumed in the metropolitan towns of the country. Do you still find that the case? Like the marketing of the movies is still very much that small town India will get the RR and the Bahubalis, the Bombays and the Bangalores of the world will get All We Imagine Is Light.
Yeah, I think it's the marketing, but it's also the industry at large, and even how we talk about it is still very much dominated by this urban and rural divide that is an imagined divide, because of these two conflicting ideas. There is true that education is important for broadening the mind and et cetera. Like, this is why we push education so much, right? But at the same time, we still fall under the trap that assuming that rural audiences are backwards and not interested, they're not refined. But the reason that I mentioned in the article is that we haven't had that confirmation with numbers is because they haven't been given the opportunity. So in the case of Lipstick, it was a self-fulfilling fallacy because they did not advertise in non-metro cities. They did not distribute in non-metro cities. And therefore, when you see the numbers of like, oh, metro cities did well, non-metro cities did poorly, so therefore we should not push to the non-metro cities. And this is again why the streaming platforms were supposed to give us this access to anyone, anywhere, and we'll have those metrics. But then you have the issues of accessibility, and of money. Like, one of the biggest drivers is, can you watch this for free or not? And one of the most watched platform in India is YouTube. You cannot have real metrics of what you watch on YouTube because it's free. and a lot of things that people watch is pirated. So there's nobody actually counting those. So there's a big gap in data
Right.
to tell us this.
Yeah, I think the streaming and the piracy is it's pretty big. And I mean, frankly, when I was growing up, India never had internet service, internet speeds which could allow you to stream stuff. So I think most people in my generation might have very vivid memories of their computers always open with some sort of torrent, absolutely illegal thing running, for nights and days. And I did that. Most people did that. So that is definitely food for thought, that despite the onslaught of the OTTs, it's still not, those are not considered, those should not be thought of as panaceas, that they can just help everyone tell the stories which should be told, and that's not always how it happens. Going from India to coming to from going from India and coming to America, what do you think of the Indian American filmmakers? Like, this is Hollywood. Indians have been coming to America for a very long time. Second generations have been doing great stuff. But when you think of Indian American filmmakers, not a lot of exemplars come to mind, right? There's a M. Night Shyamalan, there's a Dave
Right.
Patel recently with Monkey Man and all of those things. That is? Why don't you think we have more Indian Americans, or let's say Indian origin voices in Hollywood?
That is a big gap of my knowledge. I wouldn't be able to give you a good answer of like what that is. Mostly because I work on Indian cinema, not Indian American. Yeah.
Sure. No worries. I was just curious. You also work with the Austin Indie Film Festival, right? So,
Yes.
how has been your experience there, and like what are the sort of what is the level of cinema and the level of stories you often find independent filmmakers submit in those festivals?
I mean, it is, I would say, like, if you're looking for independent Indian, South Asian cinema in Austin, is the place to go. It's a very good, it's a great value for money ticket.
Right.
You get to see fantastic films for 2 days. You get to meet the filmmakers, which I think is fantastic. It's very community oriented, so you make a really good community with people in Austin, but also with the filmmakers, which is fabulous. We treat our filmmakers really well, so many want to submit again. So it's lovely to see how their work progresses with time. And like, it really puts the opportunity to watch films that otherwise you wouldn't be able to see. A great example of is a lot of the definition of South Asia, we have stretched it a little bit, which is great, to include also Iranian films. So it's a great place to find Iranian cinema. Lipstick and Burqa played here. One of my favorite films, The Threshold, played in the meme. A great thing that it does is that it gives you a lot of options from outside of the linguistic hegemony of Hindi. So I've seen a couple of Assamese films that are harder to find, like Village Rockstar. No, Village Rockstar is in Bombay. Amis was not shown, but it was submitted. Kota Nori was shown. There was used in Assamese. We also had a film of like basically like Marathi films, etc., that we don't get, especially they don't play in the movie theater in Pflugerville.
Right.
But you get to see them here and in the meme.
Okay. I love the term you use, the linguistic hegemony of Hindi. Do you think that is still the case with the South Indian films becoming so popular pan-India? Do you still think there is a case to be made for just the linguistic hegemony of Hindi language films in India?
So so there's this producers roundtable that has been going on for like several years now, and every year there's something to panic. In the latest one was this: is that the Hindi hegemony is the place that Hindi cinema had is now shifting to the south, and I do think that there is a very clear shift of what become the biggest hitters, and they're no longer in Hindi. It is those Tamil Telugu films. To an extent, and also it's funny how the industries that are very strong, they have been very strong, right? We have like they have their big stars, and it's almost like you finally are paying attention to us, right? Like it must be nice that this is new to you. But they take different places, right? Like the Malayalam film industry is known for different kind of films, the Tamil and the Telugu ones. But I think it's great. I think it's just like, it really allows people to have a like it's always good to have more in that
Right,
sense. At
right.
least that's my understanding of it. It's only the people that like rest on that power of like we have to be the center of culture that are really freaked out. But for us audiences, it's a really productive moment to like expand everything that can be. And it was for a little while really good to see, especially the Marathi film industry gaining a lot of like traction and like attention to it, especially with things like Pandri and Serat,
Yeah,
and Court as well.
yeah. Court was fine. I mean, Chaitanya Tamale is just a brilliant filmmaker, and I think growing up. So I grew up speaking Hindi primarily. That's my mother tongue, and for me, of course, Hindi film industry was the only film industry. When I talk to people who grew up either Bengali or Malayali, they would often tell me that, of course, for them, Hindi films industry was always the big game in town, but the local film industry in the vernaculars were almost as important, if not more. The fact that now I am looking forward to Malayali films and Bengali films and things like that goes to show that definitely the linguistic hegemony is breaking, and there's a little more syncretic nature to the sort of films which are that are running in India. Perfect. So let me come to my penultimate question. This is a reference to something you mentioned right at the starting about your course about Shakespeare meeting the Indian film industry. Bard meets Bollywood. Tell us a bit more about that. Like, how did you like? What's the idea? Why did you think of that?
I mean, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I feel like I just need to like go for it. When I took a class in undergrad, which basically was an adaptation course of Shakespeare and in film in general, and it was co-taught. It was a Shakespeare scholar and a film scholar, and I feel like I would feel much more comfortable that way teaching it if I had a Shakespeare scholar with me. Because even though I do have a background in literature, I by no means would call me a Shakespeare scholar.
Right.
And I would like to have like a good balance between those two. There's a lot of work of Shakespeare in India, of course, because being an Indian colony, but also, and there's a lot of plays that were plays that were put on both like Shakespeare in India in different languages, and that's very interesting. And there's a lot of adaptations actually too of Shakespeare plays. Obviously, the trilogy of
Vishal Bharat.
Makbul, Makbul, Amkara, and Heather will be the first one to teach. The many different adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, but they have also combined the Leila Majnun idea of it, but also like the last Lear, which I think is about theater in general, which I think is very nice with Amitabh Bachchan, Angur, and some others. I think what it would allow is just it's very fun, and I'm very excited.
Right.
It allows the questions of adaptation very like from the beginning, because there is not even outside of the colony connection to it. Why was this made is a very interesting question to ask, and what do you gain by adapting it? At the JFF, the Jaipur Literature Festival, there was a panel of Shakespeare in India, and one of the people speaking was talking about how he was teaching on Shakespeare, and his students would be like, I relate to this a lot. And we talk about relatability a lot, like, oh, our characters should look and we should relate to them. And that's great. And if you think about it, it's a crazy thing to say, because how could you possibly relate to Hamlet, right? A Danish prince of this past century. Like, what do you have in common with this man, right? But you do, right? The angstiness of being young and transitions and like the family drama. And what I really enjoyed about that panel was that is like we are so interested in these boxes, right? He looks like me, he has the same job, comes from my same thing. But we do relate to Shakespeare and relate to Hamlet. And like that flexibility would also allow people to relate to Shah Rukh Khan movies without having to have that background. And this is kind of one of the reasons why I want students to come to the classes, to see the flexibility of the term of relatability. And because I want to have this assignment in which I would ask my students to find a piece that they want to adapt, right? So imagine that you're doing the adaptation of the Romeo and Juliet, and you are part of this of the production, right? And you want to work on costuming? Do you want to work on the play? Do you want to work on directing? Do you want to work in acting? So to allow them to connect to something that is kind of like their interest, either their major or otherwise, and go full on. right? If you wanted to, I imagine this. If you wanted to work on costuming, then you give me sketches, but also you go look for fabric, right? Like, how is Juliet gonna look? How is she gonna be modern? Is she gonna look like all of these things? And it'll just be lovely to see what they come up to, and understand that like fidelity is not that one thing, especially how Bollywood has been like, oh, it's just a bad copy of blah. And it's like, if we can get rid of that, I think Shakespeare and Bollywood would be great.
I think no, that is, and I would completely agree, and I would really encourage you that you build this course and just take this out. Perhaps a book is there for you at the end of this course. I remember, I think this is back in the day. I remember reading this book by Jonathan Harris. It's called Masala Shakespeare, and that's right. Right. So there are certain ideas which were so revolutionary for Shakespeare, moral ambiguity, all that sort of, emotionally wrought characters, which are so easy for Indians to understand, are all back from Kalidas to everyone. We've had those moral ambiguities. We've had those emotional rottenness in our characters. So I think that's the reason why Shakespeare we just took to Shakespeare like a glove, pretty much like we took to Woodhouse, that we just really enjoy reading P.G. Woodhouse, right? As they did, despite Woodhouse having never, I don't think he's ever visited India or things like that. But no, this is fascinating. This was the Bard meets Bollywood is like, if that was a course out for us to take, I would definitely enroll for it. I would love to be a part of a class which melds Bollywood and Shakespeare. Now, Ruby, usually when we come to the end of the episode, the patent question is that for me and my listeners, recommend books, films, music, which means a lot to you. We've talked a lot about films, so perhaps start with films, then go on to books. You mentioned you grew up reading books more than watching movies. So books, films, music, which you'd love for us to check out.
That's a great question. So one, I'm gonna think of two films that I didn't talk about. And I tell this to my students, my favorite film is The Lunchbox. So again, for someone that comes from like Shah Rukh Khan Bollywood, is very different, right? So The Lunchbox definitely is a must watch. It's lovely and it's short, only 2 hours. And it has Irfan Khan. So like when you discover Irfan Khan, it's like your life will change. Queen is also great. It's a great film. If you're thinking of my background in French, so like saying that one of my favorite films is Jean Dillman by Chantal Akerman.
Yeah.
It's like the number one now in sound and sight.
Right, and sound. There was a lot of people were a little. So the place I used to work at before this, my boss is a huge movie buff, and he was a little concerned that, all right, did they give Chantal Akerman this just because of some agenda, or is she really better than Hitchcock's Vertigo? So I don't know if he's had a chance to watch it, but yeah, that's a masterpiece of a film.
So what I would say is that, and I don't know your boss, but like he's entirely wrong. Chantal Akerman is awesome. That film is fantastic. You have to watch it all the way to the end. Nothing happens until it does.
Right.
It really is one of those films, like it became like a watershed moment of my life. Like, before and after. It's fantastic. But it's long.
Yes, it is.
It's worth it.
Yeah.
But again, like Bollywood scholars can do long any day of the week. Books. One of my favorite books is by Junot Diaz, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Because it has the way that it's written in English, but like Spanish dropped in. I love the fact that it has footnotes. That is also bending the genre between fiction and nonfiction. It has one of my favorite lines that I ever read. That's one I would highly recommend. Yeah.
Wonderful. What about music? Are you big? I mean, if you like Indian movies, I'm assuming you're a music person. So which have been like your favorite songs you've heard or singers?
I'm not a huge music person, which is like the big shame of my life. But of course, the 2014 Ashiki 2 soundtrack, that was like part of my, and I might have said all these years wrong, but that whole thing, Shahumayana, Tum Hi Ho, like that dominated my playlist for like way too long. The songs for Egg Billen, the movie is not great.
Hmm.
The songs of Egg Billen, fantastic.
Hmm.
And I was just looking to my course this semester. I was just looking at the songs of like Dil Chahta Hai, like Koi Kahe, that kind of thing. So good.
Ashiki 2 was like launched the career of Arijit, so that's a watershed moment for definitely for Arijit. And again, Dil Chahta Hai, I think that's Shankar Ehsan Loy, one of those few films which the music was so new when it came out. It just had a very fresh vibe to it. But yeah, I think this has been just a wonderful discussion. As one movie lover to another, of course, I've not watched or analyzed movies in that depth as you have, so this was super like a learning opportunity for me as well. I'm definitely looking forward to your book when it comes out 2026. I'd read it, and probably then we can do one more episode just on that book, and we will talk again.
That'd be great. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thank you so much.